She was 62 years old, standing before a cabin with no heat, no running water, and a roof that drooped like something that had already surrendered. Everything she owned fit in the trunk of a 15-year-old sedan. Her husband of 4 decades had left her for a woman half his age, and made certain the court stripped Linda of anything worth holding on to. The cabin was his final mockery, a heap of decaying logs in the Colorado mountains that even he had forgotten existed. He laughed as she pulled out of the driveway, certain she would vanish. But what Richard never grasped, what none of them grasped, was that Linda and that cabin shared something no one bothered to notice. The world had written them both off, declared there was nothing inside either one still worth saving. Every single one of them was wrong. If you believe no woman carries an expiration date and that justice always finds its way home, subscribe to the channel and follow a comeback that will cleanse something deep in your chest. Linda Harrison had been 62 for exactly 3 weeks when her entire world collapsed beneath her feet. That morning started the way most of her mornings started. Coffee brewed in the kitchen of a suburban house she had kept alive for 40 years. A dinner menu forming in her mind for a husband who hadn't truly tasted her cooking in years. The house was spotless. It was always spotless. 4 decades Linda had poured into the quiet architecture of a home. 2 children raised, launched, living lives of their own. 40 years as the steady shadow behind Richard. A man who built commercial real estate empires while she built everything else. She had done it all correctly. At least, that is what she believed. The signs had been there. She understood this later. The way you understand a wound only after the bleeding starts. His evenings at the office stretching longer, a cologne she had never chosen for him appearing on his collar. The gym membership he suddenly treated like religion. Business trips that multiplied like cells dividing. But Linda had trusted him. 40 years of marriage, that was supposed to mean something. That was supposed to be a foundation. Trust is the slowest thing a person can build, and the fastest thing the world can shatter. That morning, Richard came down the stairs wearing a suit she had never seen. Expensive. Tailored close to his body, cut for a younger man's ambition. "We need to talk," he said. His eyes went everywhere except to hers. Linda's stomach fell through the floor. 4 decades sleeping beside the same man teaches you to hear what lives underneath his words. This was not about the house, not about a trip, not about scheduling. This was something else entirely. They sat in the living room, the room Linda had decorated and stripped and decorated again across the decades. The room that held every Christmas, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday that stitched the family together. Richard sat across from her, not beside her. That detail would carve itself into Linda's memory and never leave. After 40 years of sharing a life, he chose distance. "I want a divorce." Flat. Like reading a number of a receipt. I've met someone else, someone who makes me feel alive again, someone who actually understands me. Each word landed against Linda's ribs like a stone thrown hard. Quote 3. Quote. That was all she could push past her throat. Quote 4. Quote. Quote 5. Quote. Quote 6. Quote. He cut her off. Quote 7. Quote. Quote 8. Quote. Linda's voice shrank to almost nothing, a whisper that barely disturbed the air. "You're leaving me for someone our daughter's age. I'm leaving because I deserve happiness. I worked my entire life. I provided for you, gave you everything. Now I want to finally live for myself." The cruelty of it emptied her lungs. He'd provided, as though her 40 years of running that household, raising those children, propping up his career, charming his clients, keeping his world spotless and spinning, meant nothing at all. Not a single year, not a single sacrifice. 0. Richard went on. And that was it. He stood. He walked out. Gone to the office maybe. Gone to Carla probably. It didn't matter. Linda sat alone in the living room she had turned into a home with her own hands, and she understood, deeply, completely, like a stone dropping through dark water, that the life she'd known was finished. What followed was months of humiliation dressed up as legal process. Richard's lawyers came at her like wolves. Every asset, they argued, existed because of Richard's labor. The house, bought with his salary. The cars, his earnings. The retirement accounts, his career. Linda had been a homemaker. They repeated that word like it was an accusation. Homemaker, as if it meant nothing maker. As if the woman who had enabled Richard's entire empire, by managing every invisible thing in his life, the meals, the schedules, the children's fevers at 3 in the morning, the dinner parties that landed him contracts, as if that woman had contributed no financial value to the marriage. They said it out loud, in a courtroom, to a judge, and the fact that she'd buried her own ambitions to raise Michael and Jessica, the fact that she'd been his partner in every way that actually mattered, none of it registered in the cold arithmetic of divorce court. Their children tried to stay neutral. Michael, Jessica, they loved both parents. They didn't want to choose sides. Linda understood that, she did. But understanding didn't stop it from cutting. Their neutrality meant she faced this alone. No one standing beside her. No one saying, quote 13. The final hearing landed on a gray November morning, the kind of sky that looks like it's given up. Linda sat on one side of the courtroom with her court-appointed lawyer. She couldn't afford her own. Richard sat across the aisle with his legal team. And with Carla. Carla. Everything Linda was not. Young, blonde, wearing a dress that cost more than Linda's entire monthly budget. She touched Richard's arm like she owned it, smiled at him like he was sunlight. Linda watched this and felt herself shrinking, vanishing, becoming less real with every second. The judge looked bored. He read through the settlement the way a man reads a grocery list. Richard would keep the house, the cars, most of the retirement accounts. Linda would receive a modest monthly alimony for 5 years. 5 years. Enough time to get on her feet, the judge said, as if a 62-year-old woman, thrown away after 4 decades of marriage, could simply dust herself off and begin again. As if starting over at that age, with nothing, was just a matter of willpower and a good attitude. Underscore, quote, 14__. Richard's lawyer mentioned, almost an afterthought, almost a joke. A cabin in the mountains that Mr. Harrison inherited from his father. It's been abandoned for years. No utilities, no value. We propose deeding the property to Mrs. Harrison. Richard leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something. They both smirked. 2 men sharing a private laugh at a woman's expense. Quote, 16__. Linda's lawyer glanced at her, a question in his eyes. Linda had nothing left to lose, nothing left to protect, nothing left to fight for. Fine, she said quietly. The gavel came down. 40 years, dissolved in a single crack of wood against wood. As Linda walked out of the courtroom, she heard Richard's laugh trailing behind her, like a leash he still thought he held. Quote 18, quote, he called out. Quote 19, quote. Carla giggled. Linda kept walking, kept her spine straight, kept her chin level. Refused, absolutely refused, to let them watch her break. She made it to her car. Then the tears came. Hard, shaking. The kind that bend you over the steering wheel and don't stop. She sat in that courthouse parking lot, 62 years old, divorced, nearly destitute, holding nothing but the deed to a worthless property her ex-husband had handed her as one final humiliation. One last twist of the knife disguised as generosity. This was her life now. This was how 40 years of devotion ended. Not with gratitude, not with grace, with mockery. And an abandoned cabin no one wanted. Linda spent her last week in the house packing what remained of 4 decades. Richard had been generous enough to give her 7 days. 7 days to fold up an entire life and carry it out the door. She packed what the sedan could hold: clothes, photographs, a handful of furniture pieces that had been hers before she ever became a Harrison. Everything else stayed. The home she'd spent decades curating, the life she'd assembled stitch by stitch. All of it left behind for Richard and Carla to inhabit like it had always been theirs. The neighborhood friends showed up with casseroles and careful words. Divorce made people uncomfortable. They didn't know where to stand. Sam took Richard's side outright, swallowing the story whole. That Linda had let herself go, grown dull, become someone a man like Richard simply outgrew. Others offered sympathy in small doses, but kept their distance. Nobody wanted to catch whatever she had. And slowly, quietly, Linda felt herself fading, becoming exactly what Richard had declared her to be: invisible. At 62, discarded and broke, she'd become a woman people pitied over coffee, but forgot by dinner. Michael called. Jessica called. Both offered spare rooms in their homes. Both used the same careful tone. Linda heard what lived beneath the words. The hesitation. The way quote 20 appeared in every sentence. The unspoken worry about disrupted routines, about explaining to spouses, about what it would mean to absorb a mother who had nowhere else to go. Her children loved her, she never doubted that, but they were deep inside their own lives, careers, mortgages, children of their own. She would be a weight around their necks. She knew it, they knew it. Nobody said it. Quote 21 Linda told them, quote 22 quote 23 Jessica said, no softening, no cushion, just the flat truth as she understood it. Linda answered. The bitterness crept through despite her effort to hold it back. The cabin sat 3 hours north, buried in the Colorado mountains. Linda had never laid eyes on it. Richard inherited it from his father 2 decades earlier and dismissed it immediately. Too remote, too deteriorated, not worth a dime beyond the tax write-off. But it had walls. It had a roof, probably. And after the settlement, it belonged to her. On a cold December morning, she wedged the last box into her car and pulled away from the only home she'd known as an adult. She did not look in the mirror. Paved highway gave way to county road. County road narrowed into gravel. Gravel dissolved into a rutted track swallowed by brush on both sides. She nearly drove past the entrance completely. A wooden sign, paint peeling in long strips. Harrison property. No trespassing. The irony settled into her chest like a stone. She'd been trespassing in her own life for 40 years. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, Linda killed the engine and sat. Just sat. Hands on the wheel, eyes forward, not moving. Richard had called it dilapidated. He'd been generous. A log structure, maybe 800 square feet. The porch had buckled on one side, boards hanging at angles that defied gravity. Several windows gaped open, glass long gone. The roofline dipped in the center like a spine that had given up. Vines crawled across the logs. Moss consumed what the vines hadn't reached. It looked like something abandoned by people who never intended to return. Because that's exactly what it was. Linda thought about Michael's spare room. She thought about Jessica's careful offer. She thought about turning the car around, driving south, walking into one of their houses, sitting on someone else's couch, becoming someone else's quiet problem. Then she thought about Richard's face in the courtroom. That laugh, Carla beside him, amused by something on her phone. The way they'd handed her this property like a punchline. Here, take the worthless thing, it matches you now. He won't see me fall, she said it out loud, to herself, to the trees, to no one. She stepped out. Mountain air hit her lungs, cold enough to sting, sharp with pine. Silence wrapped around her like something physical. No engines, no voices, no neighbors pretending not to stare. Just wind pushing through branches, and somewhere, far off, a bird calling to another bird that may or may not have been listening. After months of courtrooms and whispered gossip and the constant low hum of humiliation, the silence landed on her skin like mercy. She crossed to the cabin slowly, tested each porch step with one foot before trusting it with her weight. The boards groaned, held. The front door was locked. But the wood framing the latch had rotted so deeply that one firm push splintered it open. The smell reached her before anything else. Mold, decay, animal droppings layered over years of nothing. Abandonment had its own particular stench. The scent of a place that had stopped being cared for so long ago, it had forgotten what care felt like. The interior was worse than the outside. A single open room with a cramped kitchen alcove, a stone fireplace blackened by decades of smoke, and a loft overhead that must have served as the bedroom. Dust blanketed everything. Debris carpeted every surface. The roof had surrendered to rain years ago. Water had poured through unchecked, season after season. Beneath her feet, the wood floor gave soft warnings. Rotted through in patches, ready to swallow a careless step. Uninhabitable by any reasonable standard. And yet, something shifted inside Linda as she stood in the center of that wreckage. Something she hadn't felt in months. Not sadness, not defeat. Anger, pure, clean, blazing anger. At what had been done to her, at the way she'd been tossed aside like something used up. At this final cruelty wrapped in legal language and disguised as property. "Fine," she said out loud, to the empty cabin, to Richard, to every person who had looked at her with that tilted head pity or quiet dismissal. "Fine. You want me to vanish into this ruin? Then watch what I build from it." That first night, she broke. She sat on the filthy floor with nothing but a sleeping bag she'd packed in the trunk. No heat, no electricity. Just the thin beam of a flashlight cutting through darkness so thick it pressed against her skin. And she wept. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of pouring herself into someone else's life. And this was the sum of it. A 62-year-old woman sitting alone on rotten floorboards in a cabin no one wanted. Discarded. Thrown away like something that had outlived its purpose. But morning came. It always does. Linda opened her eyes, dried her face, stood up. She wasn't dead. She wasn't finished. And she refused, with every aching bone in her body, to give Richard Harrison the satisfaction of watching her crumble. That first week was pure survival. She had some money, not much. The alimony payments wouldn't arrive for another month, but there was a small savings account Richard had never known about. She'd kept it quiet for years, not out of planning, just instinct. Now it kept her alive. She drove to buy what she needed: a camping stove, jugs of water, cleaning supplies, heavy work gloves, box after box of trash bags. The nearest town sat 40 minutes down the mountain. A small community clinging to the slopes, one general store, one gas station, one diner with a bell above the door. The people there watched her, a woman her age, obviously not a tourist. Loading cleaning supplies and moving boxes into a car that had seen better days. They watched, and she could feel the questions forming behind their eyes. She offered nothing. She didn't owe them explanations. She didn't need their sympathy or their silent judgment. Back at the cabin, she began with the only thing she could control: the smell, the filth. Everything else was shattered: the structure, the plumbing, the roof. But she could make it clean. She could give herself that much. She forced open the windows that still moved on their frames, letting December mountain air slice through the stale rot inside. Then she started filling bags. Old newspapers yellowed into brittle sheets, animal nests tucked into corners, broken furniture that crumbled when she lifted it. Decay she couldn't even name. The work was brutal. Linda hadn't used her body like this in decades. Her back seized after the first hour. Her hands, soft from years of light housework, years of folding laundry and arranging flowers, blistered on the first day, cracked open on the second. She stopped constantly, bent over, gasping, muscles shaking in her arms and legs. She wasn't 25. She wasn't even 45 anymore. 62. Her body screamed a number at her with every motion. But she kept going. Something in the rhythm of the work held her together. Each bag of trash she dragged out the door, that was a piece of the old life leaving. Each surface she scrubbed raw, that was a small, quiet victory no one would ever see. By the end of that first week, the cabin stood empty of debris, still ruined. The floor still soft with rot beneath her boots. The roof still wept when it rained. Mold still crawled across the walls in dark, spreading maps. But it was clean ruin now. And clean ruin was progress. The second week, she turned to the mold. She drove back to town and bought industrial cleaner, the kind that burns your nostrils through the cup, and a heavy breathing mask from the hardware store. The clerk behind the counter, a man in his 50s named Tom, actually looked up from his register long enough to speak. "That's serious stuff, ma'am. Working on a big project?" "Reclaiming my life," Linda said. The words came out before she could stop them. Tom paused, looked at her, really looked. Surprise first, then something quieter, respect. "Well, good luck with that." Linda spent days on the walls after that, mask strapped tight across her face, arms burning from the repetitive motion. Scrub, rinse, wring, scrub again. The mold had eaten deep into the wood in places. Those boards were beyond saving. They'd need to come out entirely. Linda had no earthly idea how to do that, but what she could do was scrub. So she scrubbed. It was in what used to be the kitchen, working at a patch of mold that refused to surrender, that her knuckles hit the wall and something didn't sound right. She stopped, knocked again. Hollow. She moved her fist to the wall beside it. Solid. Back to the first spot. Hollow. That was wrong. Linda leaned closer. The boards here weren't quite the same as the rest. A shade different. Set at a slightly different angle. Older maybe. Or put in by different hands. She didn't think it through. Curiosity grabbed her. Or maybe it was desperation for anything that broke the gray monotony of rot and labor. She picked up the crowbar she'd been using on the ruined floorboards and jammed it into the seam between planks. The wood was soft with moisture, weakened by years of neglect. It split without a fight. Behind it, a space, not large, maybe 2 feet deep, 3 feet across, running from floor to ceiling. A compartment, hidden on purpose. Linda's pulse kicked hard against her ribs. Someone had built this deliberately. Someone had sealed it shut. Why? What was worth hiding behind a kitchen wall in a cabin that nobody wanted? She aimed her flashlight into the gap. There, sitting on the floor of the compartment, was a wooden box. Cedar, about the size of a large shoebox. And despite the moisture that had destroyed everything around it, the box looked almost untouched. Cedar resists rot. Cedar resists insects. That's what had kept it whole while the cabin fell apart. She pulled it out with both hands, heavier than expected. She lowered herself to the floor, the box in her lap, fingers trembling. This was somebody's secret. Somebody had placed this here with intention. Richard's father, his grandfather, someone who'd walked this land long before the Harrison name was ever attached to it. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were bundles of paper, and a cloth bag. Linda reached for the papers first. They were deeds, old deeds, the kind written in ink that had faded to brown. And as she read through them, one line at a time, her heart began hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. This cabin, these 20 acres of land that everyone dismissed as worthless. They hadn't always been nothing. In 1875, the property had been registered as a mineral claim, specifically, a claim on a natural hot spring. The documents laid it out piece by piece. The spring had been discovered in 1874. Water samples had been tested, high mineral content, properties believed to promote healing. The owner had drawn up plans, real plans, engineering sketches for a bathhouse, letters from investors who wanted in. Someone had seen what this land could become. And then, a final note, dated 1876. Development postponed indefinitely due to economic panic. Will return to project when circumstances allow. Circumstances never allowed. The owner died. The property changed hands. Passed from one person to the next, like something no one particularly wanted. Eventually, it landed with Richard's grandfather, a man who almost certainly never knew what lay beneath the ground he walked on. The spring, if it still existed, if water still moved through the rock below, could change everything. Mineral hot springs with documented healing properties were the foundation of spa resorts across the world. Entire towns had been built around less. Linda set the papers down. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She opened the cloth bag. Inside were rock samples, rough, mineral-crusted stones presumably collected near the spring, and one small glass bottle, carefully labeled, sealed shut with wax. Spring water, preserved like evidence, like a promise someone made to the future and never came back to keep. Linda sat on the cold floor of a ruined cabin, surrounded by rot and silence, and the smell of decay, holding a cedar box full of history, full of possibility, full of proof that this land everyone had laughed at, this land Richard had thrown at her like garbage, had been hiding something all along. The property Richard had thrown at her like garbage, his parting humiliation, his final proof that she deserved nothing, might actually hold something extraordinary. Linda started laughing. Then the laughter cracked into sobs, then laughter again. Wild and raw and uncontrollable. He had been so certain, so smugly convinced he was handing her worthlessness wrapped in legal paper. But what he'd actually placed in her hands was the raw material for an entirely new life. The irony cut so deep it drew blood. That night, Linda drove back into town carrying something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Real, burning, directional purpose. She needed internet access. She needed answers. The diner had Wi-Fi, so she ordered coffee, opened her laptop, and started digging. Mineral springs, historical spa resorts, property development across Colorado. What she found thrilled her and terrified her in equal measure. Natural mineral springs, properly developed, held genuine value. Spa resorts built around them pulled in millions annually. But development demanded capital, permits, environmental assessments, infrastructure from the ground up. Not exactly a blueprint for a 62-year-old woman scraping by on limited funds. Unless she kept searching. And she did. Historical properties, Linda discovered, could sometimes qualify for preservation grants. Special funding programs existed for sites of documented significance. If she could establish the historical importance of that mineral spring, if she could connect it to the original development plans buried in those old deeds, she might unlock resources to bring the site back to life. A long shot, she knew that. But long shots were the only currency she had left. Over the following weeks, obsession took hold. During daylight hours, she kept working on the cabin, making it livable, making it hers. She taught herself to patch a leaking roof, ripped out rotted boards and fitted new ones. Installed a wood stove for heat because the nights in Colorado would kill you without one. YouTube became her classroom. Video after video, home repair, basic carpentry, rough plumbing. Her palms thickened with calluses. Muscles she didn't know she owned announced themselves through soreness, then through strength. She was doing work she had never once pictured herself doing. It drained her body to the marrow every single night. And every single morning, she woke up feeling more powerful than the day before. But it was the spring that lived behind her eyes, consumed her thinking. She had to locate it, had to verify it still existed, still flowed. The old deeds gave approximate coordinates, but 150 years had rewritten the landscape. Trees had matured into dense forest. Earth had shifted and settled. Linda spent hours crossing her 20 acres on foot, scanning for clues. Unusual patches of green, moisture in the soil where moisture shouldn't be. Anything suggesting water moving beneath the surface. January. 3 months after she'd first arrived at the cabin, with nothing but heartbreak and a box of old papers. She found it. A small clearing she had walked past a dozen times without a second glance. But on this particular morning, with fresh snow blanketing everything, something caught her eye. A bare patch, roughly 10 feet across, where the snow had melted faster than everywhere around it. Heat, rising from underground. Linda grabbed a shovel. 1 foot down, she felt dampness saturating the dirt. 2 feet down, water began seeping into the hole. Warm water. It was real. The spring was alive, active, flowing exactly where those century-old deeds said it would be. Linda knelt in the snow beside the muddy hole she'd carved with her own blistered hands, and she wept. Not the tears she'd cried before, not grief, not abandonment, not rage. These were different. Relief so vast it buckled her chest. Gratitude so sharp it stung. Richard had tried to erase her. He had handed her this land as his final insult. But what he'd actually given her, without knowing, without caring, without ever bothering to look, was a foundation. She had a path now. That evening, Linda picked up the phone and called her children for the first time in weeks. She told them. She described the spring, the historical documents, the plans taking shape in her mind. Michael's voice went flat with skepticism. Mom, be realistic. Developing a spa resort? That takes millions of dollars. Just watch me, Linda cut him off. You don't have to believe it. Just watch me. Jessica showed more warmth, but worry threaded through every word. Mom, please don't get your hopes up too high. Even if the spring turned out to be real, actually building something around it, that was another mountain entirely. I know it's hard. I know the odds are stacked against me. But for the first time since the divorce, I feel alive. I feel like there's a reason to wake up in the morning. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you what I've decided. From divorce to discovery, one woman's mountain miracle, the headline read. It told everything. The divorce, the worthless property, the hidden documents, the transformation of the land, and the woman who refused to let it stay dead. The article included photographs. Linda stared at those images and barely recognized the person staring back. 20 pounds had melted off her frame from months of physical labor. Her face was tanned, creased by sun and wind, but alive. Alive in a way it hadn't been in decades. Her gray hair, which she'd stopped bothering to color, was gathered in a practical bun. Jeans, flannel shirt, work boots caked with mountain mud. Nothing about her resembled the suburban housewife she'd been for 30 years. She looked like a woman who'd built something with her own 2 hands. She looked powerful. The article brought attention no one anticipated. Investors called. Spa consultants offered their services. And women wrote to her. Strangers, dozens of them, sharing their own stories of divorce and reinvention, of being discarded and choosing to stand back up. Linda hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything. She'd just been trying to survive, to rebuild. But her story had landed somewhere deep in people who needed proof that starting over was possible. In November, exactly 1 year after the divorce was finalized, a letter arrived from Richard's lawyer. Richard was requesting a meeting. He wanted to discuss the property. Linda burned the letter. 2 days later, Richard himself appeared. Linda was outside, working alongside contractors on the final details of the bathhouse construction. She saw his expensive car struggling up the rutted road toward her property. Her stomach clenched hard. She hadn't laid eyes on him in a full year. Part of her wanted to disappear inside, avoid the confrontation entirely. But the stronger part, the part forged in months of mountain exile, cold mornings, aching hands, stone laid upon stone, that part straightened her spine. She stood. She waited. Richard climbed out of the car looking somehow diminished. His suit was still expensive, but the man inside it looked older, tired. His eyes moved across the transformed property with visible shock. "Linda," he said. "Richard." 10 feet of gravel separated them. A year and a lifetime between them. "I read the article," he managed finally. "About the spring. About the development." "Did you?" It wasn't a question. "Linda, I had no idea the property was valuable. When I gave it to you, I genuinely thought it was worthless. And if you'd known, you would have kept it _47_yes, of course. Just as you kept everything else, _48_. That's not fair. I built a career. I earned—" "Stop." Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of every stone she'd lifted, every frozen morning she'd survived alone. "Just stop. I don't want to hear it again. You told me everything I contributed was worthless. Fine, you won. You got the house, the money, the young girlfriend. I got the worthless cabin. Quote 51. We're both happy with how things turned out." Richard shifted his weight, looked at the ground. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. Carla and we're not together anymore." Linda felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sympathy, nothing at all. "That's unfortunate. It is. And the business has been struggling. The real estate market's been difficult. I made some investments that didn't pan out. I'm facing some financial challenges." Now Linda understood. He hadn't driven up this mountain to apologize. He hadn't come to acknowledge what she'd built or who she'd become. He'd come to ask for money. "I see," she said carefully. "And since this property was technically marital property at the time of the divorce, I think there's a case to be made that I'm entitled to a percentage of its current value. My lawyer thinks—" "Stop!" Linda said it louder now, harder. "Richard, listen to what's coming out of your mouth. __quote_59__. You gave me this property as a joke, a parting gift wrapped in cruelty. You stood in that courthouse and you laughed at me, handed me this land because you were certain it was garbage, because you wanted one last chance to make me feel small. And now that I've turned it into something, now you want a piece. I'm just saying that legally, quote 61. Legally, the divorce is final. The deed is in my name. Every dollar of value this place holds exists because of work these hands did, discoveries I made, grants I fought for and won. __quote_62__. You contributed nothing, nothing but contempt. __quote_63__. Linda, I'm struggling. I need help. Something cracked open inside her then. Not softness, not sympathy. 40 years of silence splitting apart at the seams. After everything. Linda's voice rose, not shrill, not desperate, but full. Full of 4 decades. After 40 years of running your household so you could chase your career without a single backward glance. After raising your children, entertaining your clients, standing behind every decision you ever made with a smile on my face and my own dreams locked in a drawer. After I sacrificed what I wanted so you could have everything you wanted, You do not get to stand on my porch and tell me you're owed something. __quote_66. __. I gave you a comfortable life, Richard. You gave me a cage. And then, when I got older, when I stopped being decorative enough for your new world, you threw me away. Like I was nothing. Like 40 years meant nothing. You handed me this cabin as one final humiliation. Well, guess what? You set me free by trying to destroy me. You actually saved me. This place, this worthless property you laughed about, it taught me something I should have learned decades ago. I was never the worthless one. You were. I made a mistake, with you, with Carla, with all of it. I see that now. I'm sorry you regret your choices. Linda said it simply, and she meant it. Not as performance, not as punishment, but as truth. But your regret isn't my responsibility. I spent 40 years making your comfort my responsibility. I'm done with that. So you won't help me. Help yourself, Richard, the way I had to. Look at me, 64 years old. I hold stone. I run a business. I'm learning things that would have terrified me a decade ago. Am I exhausted sometimes? Every single day. Does my body remind me of every year I've lived? Constantly. But I am more alive right now than I ever was inside my marriage. This isn't the ending. This is where it starts. Everyone treats us like we're finished, she said, her voice cracked. Like once you pass 60, the decent thing to do is quietly disappear. Then don't be decent about it, quote 83, quote. Be loud, be difficult, be the most stubborn person in the room. Refuse to vanish. I don't want to end up where you were, Jessica said one night. The firelight caught the worry in her face. Neither do I, Linda said. So don't. Don't spend 40 years swallowing your voice to keep someone else comfortable. Don't shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's idea of who you should be. She smiled, not bitter, just honest. And if you do end up divorced, remember it might be the best thing that ever happens to you. 2 years after the papers were signed, a new envelope arrived in Linda's mailbox. Richard was filing for bankruptcy. The business, his empire, the thing he'd chosen over her, had collapsed beneath him. He was selling the house Linda had kept breathing for 4 decades. 40 years of scrubbed floors and mended curtains, and meals timed to his schedule. Part of her ached. Not for Richard, never for Richard. For what that house once held. Small shoes by the door, crayon drawings on the refrigerator, the sound of her children sleeping down the hall. Decades of life folded into those rooms. But mostly, she felt something else entirely. Light, open, free. That house had been her cage. Beautiful bars, comfortable locks, but a cage all the same. She didn't want it back. She had no use for that old life. Not a single piece of it. That spring, a spa resort company came knocking. They wanted to buy her property. The number they put on the table was staggering. Enough to erase every financial worry she'd ever carry. Enough to coast through the rest of her years without lifting a finger. Linda said no. Not because the money didn't matter. Not because she couldn't have used it. She said no because this place wasn't a transaction. It was testimony. Every board she'd hammered, every stone she'd hauled. Every morning she'd dragged her aching body out of bed to keep building. All of it was proof. Proof that the 65-year-old woman, cast aside like yesterday's newspaper, could plant herself in barren ground and bloom. Selling would have erased the evidence. But the offer handed her something else. Leverage. Linda didn't sell. She negotiated. A partnership. The resort company would pour resources into expanding her facility. In return, they'd hold a minority stake. Linda kept control. Linda kept ownership. She simply gained the tools to grow what her hands had started. By her 66th birthday, the small bathhouse had stretched into a modest spa retreat. Still steeped in history, still touched by her hands in every corner. But professional now, profitable. 8 people from the local community drew paychecks because of what she'd built. 8 families ate because a woman everyone had written off decided she wasn't finished. She'd become something no one, least of all Richard, had ever imagined she could be. A business owner. A local success story. A name people spoke with respect instead of pity. On quiet evenings, Linda still sat on her porch. The porch she'd rebuilt with her own swollen fingers. She'd look out over the mountains and let her mind travel backward. Back to the courtroom where Richard had left. Where he tossed her this property like scraps to a dog. Where his lawyers had smirked and Carla had waited in the parking lot. From that courtroom to this. To this life she'd put from the wreckage he'd intended as her burial ground. She thought about the woman she used to be. Afraid, shrinking, measuring every breath against whether Richard approved. 40 years of making herself smaller so he could feel bigger. Then she thought about the woman sitting on this porch. Strong, independent, valued. Not for what she'd sacrificed, but for what she'd created. The mineral spring hadn't been the greatest treasure. Linda understood that now. The greatest treasure had been the necessity itself, the stripping away, the forced excavation of who she actually was beneath 4 decades of compromise and quiet surrender. She'd been buried under someone else's idea of her worth for so long, she'd forgotten she had her own. Richard thought he was throwing away trash. He'd actually cut her loose. Sometimes, Linda turned this thought over like a smooth stone in her palm. The greatest gifts arrive wearing the mask of disasters. Sometimes being discarded is the same thing as being freed. Sometimes the worst day of your life is the first day of your real one. The sun dropped behind the mountains she now called home. Linda raised a glass of wine. Not to anyone else, to herself, to the cabin, to every bruised joint and sleepless night and moment of despair that had carried her here. Thank you, Richard. She whispered into the cooling air, for underestimating me, for throwing me away, for giving me the greatest gift you ever gave me, the chance to discover I never needed you at all.
She smiled. Free. Happy. More alive at 66 than she'd been at 26 or 46. The divorce hadn't been her ending. It had been her liberation. And the cabin Richard had flung at her like garbage, it had been a chest holding her real life inside it. Waiting. Patient. Just needing her to crack it open and claim what was always hers. Herself. If this story reached something inside you, leave one word in the comments about what it stirred. And if you've ever had to piece your life back together after someone tried to shatter it, tell us. Share your story. Because none of us rebuild alone. We are never too old to begin again. And no one gets to stamp a value on our worth but us. What they labeled our ending, life calls our beginning. Hold that close. 3 years after Linda's divorce became final,
her life had found a rhythm she couldn't have imagined in her darkest days. The spa retreat was thriving, booked out months ahead. The cabin and grounds had grown into a destination, written up in travel magazines, wellness blogs, and historical tourism guides. But for Linda, the real transformation had nothing to do with the property. It lived inside her. She rose before the sun each morning, made coffee in a kitchen she'd torn apart and put back together with her own 2 hands. Then she'd stand on the porch she'd restored plank by plank, and watch light spill across the mountains. Every inch of this place carried a scar of her becoming. The floorboard she'd pried up and replaced. The walls she'd scrubbed until her shoulders burned. The garden she'd planted in soil everyone said was too rocky to grow anything worth growing. This wasn't a property. This was proof. Proof that a woman the world had thrown away could build something that mattered. Her blog had become something she never planned for. Rebuilding at 60-some, over 50,000 followers now. Women of every age, but especially the ones past 50. The ones who'd been told, quietly or loudly, that their best years were behind them. Linda posted every week. Practical things. How to fix a leaking pipe, how to patch drywall, how to winterize a cabin alone. But also the harder things. Aging, independence, what it means to discover your own worth after 6 decades of measuring it through someone else's eyes. The comment section had turned into something sacred, a gathering place. Women holding each other up through divorces, career losses, children who stopped calling, bodies that ached in new ways every morning. Women navigating a world that worshipped youth and discarded everything else. One post had cut deeper than the rest. Linda had written about the day Richard appeared at her cabin, about his request for money, about the hollowness she felt when she turned him away. Not anger, not satisfaction, nothing, just nothing. For 40 years, his opinion of me was my opinion of me, she'd written. His approval was my purpose. His disappointment was my failure. The greatest gift of divorce wasn't the cabin or the spring. It was learning I could survive, could thrive, without his validation. I spent 62 years believing my worth came from taking care of others. I'm spending my 60s learning that my worth comes from taking care of myself. That post traveled. Tens of thousands of shares. Women wrote to say it gave them courage to walk out of marriages that had been hollowing them for years. To start businesses they dreamed about since their 30s. To pick up brushes, tools, enrollment forms. All the things they'd set down when someone told them it wasn't their turn anymore. Linda read every message. She hadn't set out to inspire a single soul. She'd just been trying not to drown. But it turns out, the act of refusing to drown, that itself is a lighthouse. The business grew at its own steady pace. Linda brought on a manager to handle the daily operations. This freed her hands for the work she actually loved, designing new treatments drawn from the mineral water, leading guests through the history buried in these hills, sitting with people who arrived carrying wounds they couldn't name. Because most of the women who came weren't really there for spa treatments. They came because they'd read her words. They wanted to stand where she stood, touch the walls she'd rebuilt, see with their own eyes that reinvention after 60 wasn't a fantasy sold in self-help books. It was real. It was possible. It was happening right here on this porch. Linda made time for every one of them. She'd pull up a chair, pour 2 cups of coffee, and listen. Some were freshly divorced, hands still shaking, voices still thin with terror. Others were considering living, but couldn't imagine life without the security they'd built around themselves, like a cage. Still others were happily married, but felt like ghosts in their own homes. Invisible, irrelevant, dismissed by a culture that looked at aging women and saw problems, not people. You're not invisible, quote 94 Society wants you to believe that. Because invisible women don't demand their share of resources, of respect, of opportunity. But you're only invisible if you agree to disappear, refuse. I don't know who I am without him, Patricia said, her voice barely held together. I was his wife for so long, now I'm just nobody. Quote 98 You're not nobody, Linda told her. You're someone who gave 50 years to a partnership. That's beautiful. But you're also someone separate, with your own hands, your own mind, your own dreams that got folded up and put in a drawer so long ago you forgot they were there. It's not too late to open that drawer. She held Patricia's gaze. I started over at 71. At 62, Linda said plainly. You're ahead of the game. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 103 underscore, underscore. Thank you for showing us it's possible. That exchange burrowed into Linda and stayed. She understood, slowly at first, then all at once. She had become something she never intended to be. A symbol, proof. The cabin, the business, the blog, none of it was the point. They were scaffolding around something far more important. A message that had been building itself without her permission. That a woman's life does not expire at menopause, does not dissolve at retirement, does not end at divorce or widowhood. That 60 or 70 or 80 can be a doorway swinging open, not a door slamming shut. That reinvention has no expiration date. On the 4th anniversary of her arrival at that cabin, Linda opened her doors wide. She invited her blog readers, neighbors from town, strangers, anyone who wanted to come and see. Hundreds showed up. The property, filled with women of every age, wandering through the bathhouse, walking the trails, sitting on stumps and stone benches, telling each other things they'd never said aloud. Late in the afternoon, Linda climbed onto her porch and faced the crowd. 4 years ago, I arrived here with nothing. My marriage was gone. My home was gone. My sense of who I was, gone. My ex-husband handed me this property as a punchline. He expected me to crumble. I nearly did. Those first weeks, I cried every single night. Fear sat in my chest like a stone. Loneliness pressed on me from every direction. I was certain, absolutely certain, that I was too old to begin again. I was wrong. And every woman who has ever been told she's too old, too worn out, too far past her prime to build something new, that woman has been lied to. We are not finished at 50. We are not expired at 60. We are not done contributing, creating, growing at 70. We are not invisible, unless we decide to be. This cabin was supposed to humiliate me. Instead, it set me free. And I need every woman standing here to hear this. Whatever you're carrying, whatever was taken from you, whatever number the calendar says you are, it is not too late. It is never too late to rebuild, to reinvent. To refuse, absolutely refuse, to accept someone else's definition of who you're allowed to become. The applause broke like a wave against rock. Women wept. Strangers grabbed each other's hands, exchanged phone numbers, made promises to call. Linda had not planned a movement, but a movement had grown anyway. A gathering of women who refused to disappear quietly into the margins of someone else's story. That evening, after the last car pulled away, Linda's children came. Michael and Jessica, both in their 40s now, settled beside their mother on the porch they'd helped her rebuild during a visit 2 summers back. The wood beneath them still smelled faintly of cedar. "Mom, you're incredible, underscore underscore, quote underscore 106 underscore underscore. How did you do all of this, underscore underscore, quote underscore 107 underscore underscore. Honestly, I didn't have a choice. When everything is stripped away, everything, you either lie down or you start laying stones. I started laying stones. But if I'm being truthful, the only reason I had the strength was because I was furious. 40 years of my life, dismissed like spare change. That anger carried me through the first year. It burned hot enough to keep me moving when nothing else could. After that, something quieter took its place. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. The slow, shocking realization that I could actually do this. Do you ever regret it? The divorce? Do you ever wish Dad had stayed? I regret how it happened. The cruelty of it. The humiliation. I regret every year I spent making myself smaller than I needed to be. Shrinking so he could feel tall. But the divorce itself? No. It freed me to become who I actually am, instead of who I thought I had to be for him. If he'd stayed, I would have grown old inside a comfortable cage. Polished, pretty, empty. I never would have discovered I could do any of this. Silence settled around them. Stars appeared over the mountains, one by one, like someone was lighting them by hand. The three of them sat together in the cool air, listening to the world breathe. Finally, Michael spoke. Dad called me last week. Linda felt something move inside her. Not pain, not curiosity really, just acknowledgement. A door she'd closed long ago, rattling faintly in its frame. How is he struggling? The bankruptcy devastated him. He rents now, works under someone else's name, someone else's vision. He asked about you, wanted to know if what he's been hearing is real. And what did you say? I told him you're thriving, that you built something extraordinary, that you're genuinely happy. Linda gave a slow nod. Good. Tell him I hope he finds his own way to peace. When her children drove away, Linda settled into her porch chair the way she did most evenings, alone. The mountains holding their silence around her. She thought about Richard. Not the Richard who'd handed her divorce papers like a receipt, but the Richard she'd married, the young man with plans and promises. She thought about what he'd become, about his collapse, about her rise. And she waited for satisfaction to arrive. It didn't. His suffering brought her nothing. His ruin didn't stitch her wounds. His failure didn't make her success taste sweeter. She'd learned this truth the hard way. Revenge is a meal that fills no one. The real victory was never his regret. The real victory was her freedom. 4 years of hauling stone and sanding wood and learning to wire a cabin that should have been condemned. 4 years of discovering a kind of strength that had lived inside her all along, untested, unnamed, unclaimed. 4 years of standing shoulder to shoulder with women she never would have known in her old life. 4 years of proving, to herself, not to him, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's opinion. That was enough. That was more than enough. The mountain air turned sharp as evening deepened. Linda rose to go inside. Her hand found the door she'd repaired with her own swollen fingers, reinforced with brackets she'd learned to install from a library book, painted a color she chose because she liked it, not because it matched anything, not because anyone approved. She remembered the first time she touched this door, how it gave way under almost nothing, how the wood crumbled, how rotten everything was, the frame, the hinges, the threshold. How rotten she'd felt standing there. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone who knew what she was made of. Someone who'd proven, not to the world, not to Richard, but to herself, that endings could crack open into beginnings. That disaster could be unwrapped like a gift you didn't ask for but desperately needed. That a woman the world called disposable could become an empire unto herself. Linda smiled, stepped inside, closed the door firmly behind her. Tomorrow she'd rise at dawn. She'd tend to her business, write her blog, welcome another woman arriving with hollow eyes and shaking hands. She'd keep building the life she'd carved from what everyone else called wreckage. Because that's who she was now, a builder, a creator, a woman who refused to vanish. A woman who would never again hand someone else the pen to write her worth. The cabin Richard threw at her like garbage had become a palace. But the cabin was not the point. The woman he discarded as worthless had discovered she was priceless. That was the real treasure. That was the real transformation. That was the only victory that ever mattered. 5 years after the divorce, Linda stood at a podium in front of a ballroom filled with women. A conference for female entrepreneurs over 50. She'd been invited to tell her story. How she built a business from bare dirt and broken boards. How she started over when starting over seemed like a cruel joke. She looked out at the audience. Hundreds of faces, all over 50. All carrying their own wreckage, their own reinventions, their own proof that the world had been wrong about them. Gratitude hit her so hard she had to grip the podium. "I'm 67 years old," she said. Her voice was steady, her hands were not. "When I was 62, my husband of 40 years looked me in the eye and told me I was worthless. When I was 62, I lost everything I believed defined me: the house, the marriage, the life. When I was 62, I was certain my story was finished. I was wrong about every single word of that. These last 5 years have been the hardest of my life, the most exhausting, the most painful, and the most real, most powerful, most genuinely mine. I rebuilt a cabin with these hands," she held them up, scarred knuckles, crooked fingers. "I started a business. I uncovered something hidden. But the real treasure was never what I found buried in a wall. It was what I found buried in myself. Strength I never knew lived there. Resilience I'd never once been asked to use. A worth that was mine, that had always been mine, that never needed a single person's permission to exist." She paused, let the silence hold. "To every woman in this room who has been told she is too old, too late, too far past her prime, I am standing here to tell you that is a lie. It is never too late. Your life isn't over. It's only now beginning." 5 minutes the ovation lasted. 5 full minutes of women on their feet, tears streaming, hands raw from clapping. Afterward, they lined up, not for autographs, not for photos. They lined up to tell her their own stories. To whisper the things they'd never said aloud. To ask, not for answers really, but for permission. Permission to believe they could do the same. Linda stood with every single one of them. She listened. She held hands that trembled. She offered what she'd learned, not as advice, but as proof. Proof that the bottom is not the end. Proof that hands which ache can still build worlds. And she marveled, quietly, at what had grown here. Not just a business, not just a retreat. A gathering place for women the world had forgotten. A tribe of the discarded who refused to stay thrown away. That evening, alone in her mountain cabin, Linda opened her laptop one last time. She wrote slowly, every word deliberate. Every sentence pulled from somewhere deep, from the woman who'd stood in an empty parking lot with nothing, and from the woman who sat here now, surrounded by everything that mattered. Quote 122. She published the post, closed the laptop, let the screen go dark. Then, she stepped outside. Mountain air hit her lungs, sharp, cold, alive. Stars scattered above her cabin, her palace, her empire, her home. Every stone placed by hands that doctors said couldn't grip anymore. Every beam raised by a back that screamed with every lift. Every inch of it, hers. Not given, not inherited, not found. Built. Linda smiled. Not the polite smile she'd worn for 30 years of dinner parties. A real one. Free. Full. The smile of a woman who finally recognized her own face. The divorce hadn't destroyed her. It had stripped away everything that was never really hers. The title, the house, the role she'd played so long she'd forgotten it was a costume. And what remained, once all of that fell away, was magnificent. If Linda's story reached something inside you, leave one word in the comments. Just one word for what you feel right now. And remember, what they called your ending is really your beginning. You are not too old. You are not too late. You are not too finished. Start rebuilding.